So, it's time to start this first lunch lecture in SLU Framtidslabbet, or SLU Futures Lab. And most welcome to all of you who are here in Ultuna today, and also thank you to all of you who are joining us from Alnarp, Umeå, Skara, and from wherever you have placed your computer today. My name is and I'm the project leader for the SLU Framtidsplattformen. I work with the platform together with Emma Salgren, who is the project assistant. So if you have any questions about Framtidsplattformen, you're most welcome to reach out to any of us. Today we have an external guest who will introduce a research project that explores a specific set of societal challenges related to sustainability and economic growth. For that, I would like to say a few words about the Framtidslabbet. For those of you who don't know it, the Framtidslabbet is a new initiative, and it's an initiative designed to support an interdisciplinary exploration of future challenges. And as researchers work with the future already in one way or another, and we acknowledge that, and the aim of Framtidslabbet is to see how we can further this exploration of future challenges. And Framtidslabbet is an initiative by two of SLU's Framtidsplattformer, the future platforms, namely SLU Urban Futures and SLU Future Food. And before introducing Ulrika, I would also like to remind those of you who join us via video conference to shut off your microphones. And there will be some time for questions in the end, and then you're, of course, most welcome to turn your microphone back on if you have a question. I would also like to remind those of you who are here in Ultuna that this lecture is being recorded and will be posted online at SLU's video streaming service and also at YouTube. And if you don't want to be seen in that video, you should sit towards the back of the room. So if everyone would like to change their place, you can do so. Okay. Great. So, Ulrika Gunnarsson-Östling, who is a docent, associate professor at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. And Ulrika's field of study is the broad and interdisciplinary field of planning and decision analysis. And Ulrika will tell us more about a research project that you have been part of, and that I think at least some of you here today already have heard of. So, I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Susan, for inviting me. It's nice being here. And as Susan told you, I will tell a little bit about a research program that I took part in. And today I will focus more on the process of developing scenarios as we did. You don't hear me? And now? Better? Sorry. Okay, so I will tell a bit about a research program that I worked within during several years. And today the focus will be on the process where we developed backcasting scenarios with multiple targets. So that's why the lecture is called Futures with Multiple Targets, Scenarios Beyond GDP Growth. And Scenarios Beyond GDP Growth was the name of the research program that I will use as an example. When we started the research program, or when we applied for money from the beginning, we started out from knowing that today we have a great awareness about environmental issues and climate threats. And that was some years ago, and maybe on DN, one of the largest daily newspapers, to see. We still have those news about environmental issues and climate issues. Here we have a news saying that species are might be lost for all future due to the fires in Australia. We have an article here about that it's starting to get problematic to own so much stuff and gadgets as we do today, because it's so cheap, so we buy too much and it becomes troublesome. And then Greta Thunberg striking for the climate. And those examples of news that we can see today, and if some 4 years we had a lot of news about climate and the environment also back then. But at the same time, we also could read almost every day about the importance of economic growth, and a lot of articles putting forward that if we have more economic growth, that can also help us to have more money to the state, which is helpful in order to develop a good welfare society.
Scenario beyond GDP growth. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
A brief reminder to everyone joining via video conference, please turn your mics off.
No worries. And this means that economic growth is often seen as a mean in itself. So it's often set as a target that we should reach. But we were thinking that maybe there is a problem if we see economic growth as the target that we should reach. What about our social and environmental issues that we have today, and goals that we could have about those developments? What should we do if we want them to be more in the forefront, so to say? So these were thoughts that we had, and we then decided to apply for money for the research environment beyond GDP growth, scenarios for sustainable building and planning. And we got money from Formas, so the research program was running between 2014 and 2018. And we were researchers, 17 researchers from 5 different universities or research institutes. And we also had a reference group made up of different societal partners, like municipalities, regions, and other actors, and also an international reference group made up of researchers. So that was how we started, and we decided to engage 3 different case study areas, or actually municipalities within Sweden. And those were Övertorneå, up in the northern part of Sweden. I'm sorry, the statistics here is in Swedish. It only says how large the surface is and how many inhabitants the municipality have, and then saying that Övertorneå is a sparsely populated municipality with decreasing population. So they have certain issues that they see as important right now, or when we started as well. Then we have Alingsås, which is close to Gothenburg, so it's part of a growing, or a region where you have a growing population. And then we had Malmö, down in the south, where you have a population growth as well. And we wanted to have different kinds of municipalities to work with as case study areas, because we wanted to receive input from different parts of Sweden, and also from parts where you had different problems that you saw as the most important. So we wanted to receive input from those different areas. So then we were ready to start exploring what sustainable building and planning could look like. And when you have large problems that we saw that we had, so large sustainability problems, but also large social problems, we saw that you need to think differently about the future. So we wanted to explore new possible solutions and therefore also raise questions about what we need to do today. So we asked ourselves, how do we want the future to look like? And even though, of course, it is impossible to think something that is completely new or freeing yourself completely from beliefs, norms, etc. that we have today. We wanted to try to push ourselves to think differently. And we wanted, for example, to explore ideas of how could a good life look like in the future if we maybe could define it in another way than we do today. And the premise for the research program then was that the future is possible to affect. It's possible to affect the future by, for example, politics, planning and decision making. So this means that we wanted to go beyond the idea that we are like totally bounded by today's current trends. We wanted to explore the idea that it's possible to break negative trends and build on positive trends in order to strive towards another future. So that is why we decided to work with future studies technique called backcasting. And to put it simple, it means developing images of the future, describing how the future could look like when certain targets are reached. So define targets. And then to analyze current trends and potential to reach those targets. So what kind of trends do we have today? Does it seem like we are going to reach the targets? And then develop images of the future where we actually reach the targets. And then analyzing, so if we look on today's situation, how close are we to reaching those futures or images of the future, and what could be done if we want to reach them? So what could be strategies useful if we want to reach those different futures? And when analyzing this, you could find answers to what do we need to do today, but you could also find conflicts or difficulties or things that would or could hinder our way forward. But I will come back to those 4 steps. So I just wanted to show this image also to show that the images of the future that we developed, they had a target year of 2050. And as I said, we tried to free ourselves as much as possible from the norms that we have today and try to describe other possible futures that are quite far into the future. And looking closer at those steps, these were the steps that you could see in the image as well. So we have first the problem definition and establishment of criteria and targets for what is to be achieved. What are the most important targets that we want to fulfill when developing those images of the future? And then the second step, analyzing present potential and future challenges for achieving targets by analyzing current trends and expectations. So do we have trends that seem to lead us towards this future? Then it's good. Then we want to keep those trends and kind of build on them. But if the trends are negative, if it seems like we are not reaching our target, then we need to find ways of breaking those trends. Then the third step in this backcasting process is to develop scenarios that strive towards meeting the targets. So developing what I also call images of the future. Maybe you heard that I vary between those words. Scenarios is very often used in future studies, but I kind of like the word images of the future. It explains rather well what it is that you do. You want to describe how the future could look like. And then the fourth step is to analyze how well the targets and criteria are achieved and analyze the consequences for policy and planning. So when creating those images of the future, brainstorming, having workshops, etc., and then having this description of the future, is that the description that actually fulfills the targets that we wanted it to, or did we succeed in that or not? So I will come back to those steps and tell a bit about how we did in this project. So when it comes to the first step of problem definition and establishment of criteria and targets for what is to be achieved, we decided to ask ourselves which goals that are most relevant to explore in a Swedish context, and then later ask ourselves how these can be operationalized into a Swedish context. Because we had decided that we wanted to develop the scenarios for Sweden. And of course you could do this or a similar project where you look closer into other regions, other countries. We choose Sweden because we think it's important for a country that has such large environmental impact as we do to see what we could do to try to minimize this environmental impact. But which are then the most relevant goals to explore? We decided upon those criterions. So first we wanted the goals to be easy to operationalize. So we wanted them to be able to be defined in a rather easy way. We found this important so that we could later on evaluate whether our scenarios or images of the future actually reach the targets that we wanted them to reach. At the same time, you often say that you shouldn't always be too precise, because maybe if you make them too precise, there is only one way of reaching that target. So that was some kind of balancing between being very precise and also open to different kinds of solutions. And how could we verify that? Well, we looked into how they had been kind of put into practice in previous projects, but we also had a lot of discussions within our research, or rather the project groups, not only researchers, but also with the societal partners. We wanted them to be relevant to planning and policy in Sweden, because we wanted the output from our research program to be useful for practitioners. So therefore, we reviewed a lot of existing goals and had discussions with our societal partners about what goals are already used in Sweden. Are they useful or not? Are there anything missing? We wanted our goals to be central to sustainability. And we verified that by looking into research to see what is put forward as the most pressing social and environmental issues. And we also looked into Swedish policies to see what are the pressing issues that we have. And then lastly, we wanted everyone in the project to stand behind the goals as representing sustainability. And that meant that we had a lot of project meetings and workshops to discuss how can we actually define sustainable development, and is it even possible to find some kind of consensus on what do we mean with sustainable development? Because when it comes to sustainable development, I've been saying myself a lot of times that this is one of those like large and fuzzy concepts that can be defined and interpreted in so many different ways. So that is what I can hear myself saying. At the same time, I just said, now we have to find some targets, and we have to agree upon them so that we can actually develop our scenarios in a way that they fulfill those targets that represent sustainable development. And then I would say that it's when sustainable development is put into practice, then it often comes to mean different things. It's interpreted in different ways by different actors that decide to do different things because that is why or how they believe sustainable development look like. But there is also broad consensus that sustainable development includes environmental aspects such as the natural planetary boundaries and carrying capacity of ecosystems, as well as social aspects such as social justice, equality, and governance issues. So even if I just said that it can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, there is also some consensus on what to include. And we were especially inspired by Kate Raworth, who combined those essential dimensions of sustainable development and present them in a diagram that I will soon show. That is called the donut model of sustainable development, which is a safe and just space for humanity. So we decided to use this as a starting point when trying to find the goals that our scenarios should fulfill. And maybe you have already seen this before. So it's a way of combining the planetary boundaries in the outer circle with a social foundation, the inner circle. And it's a way to illuminate that even though we have planetary boundaries, in order to safeguard social sustainability, we also need to use natural resources in order to have food, water, energy, but also things like health, education, etc. Then we need to use resources. And then in order to have social sustainability, we need things like social equity, gender equality, political voice, etc. So this is one way of trying to combine social and ecological issues that we found inspiring when trying to develop the targets that we wanted our scenarios or images of the future to reach. So we actually started out by formulating preliminary goals for each donut area. And then based on the criterions that I showed before and also prioritizations by especially our societal partners and the research groups, we decided on 4 preliminary goals. So we wanted to focus both on the ecological side, climate change and land use change, and then more social-oriented, relating to welfare and resource security. So these were the targets areas: climate, land use, we call it participation, and welfare or resources. And we could see that there were established ways of defining the ecological targets, and then when it comes to the social targets, it was a bit more difficult to quantify, but we could relate it to Swedish policy goals that we already have. And this was then a huge process, but we involved our partners in order to try to find relevant goals, and we found them then central to sustainable development, and all the project groups were involved and satisfied. And this is how we actually then defined the targets. So for climate, Sweden is to be fossil-free by 2050, which means no fossil fuels are used as fuels or industrial processes, and that a maximum of 0.82 tons carbon dioxide equivalents consumptive emissions per capita per year in Sweden. So it was a way of calculating back then how much carbon dioxide could be emitted if we still wanted to stick to climate targets, and if we were to divide that equally all over the world. So that's just one way of trying to understand how much we could emit in Sweden. You could, of course, also argue that countries that did not already emit as much as Sweden should be allowed to emit much more. But this was how it was defined for our scenarios. And then when it comes to land use, the target was set to the per capita land area used for final consumption does not exceed the global biocapacity, and then also divided per capita. And distribution of power, influence, and participation in society. Then we said that all residents in Sweden, regardless of, for example, gender expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and religious affiliation, age, disability, class, and income level, should be entitled to participate in and influence political choices and decision-making that affect their lives. So it was one way of trying to be more precise of what we meant with that target. And when it came to welfare or resource security, we said that residents in Sweden should have sufficient access to resources and services that can create opportunities for housing, education, social care, and social security, as well as favorable conditions for good health, and that the distribution of the same resources and services should be made according to some fairness principle. And as you can see here, we did not choose to have, for example, jobs or the right to have a salary here. Instead, we choose to focus on the access to services and resources. And the reason was that we wanted to keep the way of describing the future very open. And we thought maybe in the future, salary is not the main way of having access to those kind of resources or services. Or at least we wanted to be able to explore societies organized in a different way. So that is why we defined our target in this way. And as you see, depending on how you define your targets when you are to develop images of the future, you also open up for some ways of describing that futures, and you close some ways of describing that future. And it's important to keep in mind that even if we want to describe very different futures, it's also so that we always put some direction to what we want to explore, and that means at the same time that we close off some ways of describing the future. And here, that the distribution of the same resources and services should be made according to some fairness principle. It was one way of keeping it a bit fussy, so that we could explore different ways of distributing resources. And in the beginning of the project, we didn't want to decide upon like what is a fair or just way of distributing resources, how big differences could there be between groups' access to resources and services. This was something that you could explore them in the images of the future. Images. So these were the targets. Then the next step was to analyze present potential and future challenges for achieving those targets. And we did that by analyzing current trends and expectations. In short, we found that the two environmental goals imply very large reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and land use for consumption in Sweden. So all our scenarios, the 4 that we later on developed, means a radical change from the consumption that we have today in Sweden. And sometimes when we have been presenting the scenarios, the final results, people tend to forget about this and think that, yeah, maybe they are quite similar to the life that we have today. But no, none of them are very similar to the life that we have today, because all of them mean a very decreased consumption. And the goal related to greenhouse gas emissions is similar to goals that have been set for previous backcasting studies related to, for example, transportation. So it's a quite common target to have. But we developed it further, acknowledging both the consumption perspective and a stricter maximum temperature rise. That was how we did it. So quite often you look at how much carbon or greenhouse gas emissions that we produce in Sweden, but we also looked at all the consumption that we do in Sweden, even if we consume things produced in other countries. And the land use goal was more new, and we saw that it could turn out to be rather demanding. And regarding the social goals, we could see that in many aspects they are reasonably well fulfilled in Sweden. So the challenge is more about ensuring that you could keep having similar opportunities for Swedish residents, which was the focus of these scenarios. And then the main challenge being to ensure that the goals are fulfilled even within environmental limits, and even if we have economic growth or degrowth, because we could see that the way that we wanted to explore the possibilities to reach those different targets could imply that we would not have economic growth. And we saw that as something that was good to explore, since economic growth, degrowth, could happen whether we want it or not. So it could be good to be prepared for that, no matter how you view it. If you view it as something that could help you to reach sustainability, or if you see it as a threat. So the third step then in the backcasting process was to develop the scenarios that strive towards meeting the targets. And this was also a huge process. I mean, we were many researchers, and we had many societal partners that we wanted to engage in the process. We wanted to actually develop the scenarios together. That was our starting point. Now, in retrospective, I would say that the main work was done by researchers, even though we tried to listen in to the societal actors. But I mean, often you talk about co-creation, for example, and how you could gain a lot of important knowledge by co-creating science together with different actors. And I would say that we tried, but that we didn't really succeed. So even though societal partners were involved and they were really engaged in different workshops and so on, the main work was done by researchers. So we started the scenario generation with identifying relevant aspects and also theories to explore. So when we had seen what kind of sustainability problems we had, and we had decided what targets we wanted to meet, what could then be ways to explore different futures. And we wanted to look into both more theoretical perspectives and also examples that we could see in society that could maybe be seen as forerunners. So we made literature studies, and we had a workshop early on. Later on we had many more, but early on with together with our societal partners. We had workshops in our case study scenarios with a lot of different actors, like politicians and people working in the healthcare, NGOs, etc., in order to understand what challenges they saw right now. And then we made interviews with experts. And the participants in the workshop, they voted on what they saw as the most important and least certain aspects. So we wanted to focus on things that were very important, and if they were important but trends showed that it's not, we are not close to reaching them or so, we wanted to focus on them. And then, based on all those aspects and theoretical approaches, we started by developing 20 scenario sketches. So that was the beginning, and then they were very, very sketchy, building on all those different ideas that we got from the literature and from the societal partners. And this is just a list, just to show you how this process looked like. Which is a bit nice, because most often when I've been presenting those scenarios, I'm just asked to present the final result. But this is how we started, and we made sketchy scenarios about the new commons, automated production, global justice, no profit, managing power conflicts, circular economy, and so on. So a lot of different issues that we decided, or that we tried to do sketchy scenarios about. And we kept on having workshops with the societal partners and the research team, and we received a lot of input regarding like potential imaginations of what might have had happened in the Swedish economy if we ended up in those 20 different scenarios. What made us reach those different futures? What happened in the economy, and what kind of governance might dominate those different scenarios, and why? So we tried to sort them to see are there any similarities when it comes to the view on what happened in the economy and what happened with governance. And based on those inputs, the scenario sketches were merged or removed, because some build on similar ideas, like similar ideas upon governance or similar ideas upon what happened in the economy. So then we were down to 13. And then we did more filtering, and now thinking about what would the scenarios mean in terms of GDP growth. And we wanted to remove sketches that explicitly assumed continued GDP growth, since we wanted especially to focus on what could happen if we do not have economic growth, even though it's not that there can't be an economic growth in the scenarios, but it's not the most important thing. So they do not start out from saying that we have GDP growth as a target. And then we processed the remaining sketches, like back off, just did that. And then in the end, we had 4 scenario sketches that we fleshed out into a test version of the scenarios, with more information and description of how we actually develop them and why we reason as we do. And these are published in a report in Swedish, and then these were further developed in workshops and by researchers into the scenarios that were kind of the end product in the research program, even though I prefer not to say that they are the end product, because the scenarios in themselves are not that valuable, but what they are valuable for are to base discussions on them. So, for example, we went back to our case study municipalities in order to discuss what could those futures mean for them, how could they use the scenario descriptions, and so on. And I wanted to say something about the scenarios that we actually picked. One of them is called Automation for Quality of Life. And it builds on the idea that we have a strong technological development, or had that. So in 2050, technology have developed a lot, and we have a lot of automatization and robotization. But we'd also have a society where resource efficiency have increased. So it's a very effective society, and it's so effective that people do not have to work much any longer. That is why you see this person reading a book. They're playing some ping pong up there while things are going on in the industry anyhow. So people are just working like 10 hours a week. That is the new norm. And the work at home is also to some extent automated, which means that people do actually have a lot of extra spare time in this imagined future. So it's not so that they work very little for a paid job and then work a lot with unpaid job, but instead there is a lot of spare time. And people mainly live in larger cities. And this is also where you have like welfare services and so on in a very like efficient way. And the state sees too that there is basic security for everyone. So the idea is not that people have to take care about like elderly and so on their spare time, just to the extent that they kind of like it. And this idea was then built upon trends that we can see already today, and that is the idea with all of the and often when we present the scenarios, there will be some people saying, yeah, this is exactly how I think the future will be, or we're already there. And some will say, no, it's impossible, it can't happen. But people say that about different scenarios, so there tend to be different ideas upon what is the most likely future. And I sometimes get a question like, what is the most likely future, do you think? And I say, I don't think any of those scenarios are likely, because it depends upon what we decide, what kind of future do we want, and I guess it's none of this, but maybe something in between, I don't know. Anyhow, a second scenario was called collaborative economy, and here ownership has been moved from being privately owned to being owned by public or communal ways of owning or sharing things. So you own things together, and production of things and services is made in cooperatives and other associations. And most people are what we call prosumers, so they are not either producing things or consuming them, but they do both. So they produce and they consume. And oops, sorry, what happened? It also builds on the ideas of digitalization that have made it possible to easily share ideas and knowledge, and also to be able to live in many different places in the country. So in this scenario, we don't have the strong focus on the larger cities, but instead people live in clusters. It could be smaller cities and so on. So not spread all over Sweden, but in different clusters. And there is like public transport and so on. And when it comes to planning and decision making, people are very engaged and take part in this. So it builds on the idea of very active citizens. that takes part in both decision making and in the organization of society. So while in the automation society, citizens didn't have to be active at all. They could just relax and have a lot of spare time when they could do whatever they wanted. Here, people are very active in society, and there is no clear division either between work life and spare time. So you're always active in different things. And again, this also builds on ideas that we can see already today, where we have different solutions for sharing things with your neighbors, for example, and often digital solutions that also help you to share or give away things and so on. Our third scenario is called local self-sufficiency, and here Sweden is very good in using local resources and has a very high degree of self-sufficiency. And here people have a consumption that is based on what can be produced locally. So even though some things are still imported, the greater part of the consumption is actually produced in Sweden. And here municipalities have a strong power over the local development, and people are involved in that. It's important for people to live close to where they can also gain their income, whether it's from like growing food or producing things locally. And economic activities are very localized, so not only localized in Sweden as such, but also localized in different regions or municipalities in Sweden. Yes, and again, building on trends that we see today, and those images are actually from one of the studies that we made within the project, because except for like all those workshops and reading that we did in coming up to the scenarios, we did different kinds of studies focusing on different issues, and one of the issues was housing and how will we live in the future. And in order to explore that, we also looked upon how people choose to live today, and how especially some groups, they are not that many, but some groups we can see today that move outside the bigger cities in order to become more self-sufficient and develop different ways of organizing this kind of life. So we did these kind of studies as well. Fourth scenario is called circular economy in the welfare state. And here we don't have any waste any longer. So all products are designed in order to be easily reused and or recycled. And the economy is based very much on consumption of resources, services that are not as resource intensive. The welfare state here is very dependent on well-functioning industry. So here we have the kind of cooperation between the industry and society. That was very quick about the scenarios. I just wanted to say something about them, and also to say then that the fourth step of analyzing how well the targets and criteria are achieved, we did that as well in different kinds of studies, and this is just to show how the scenarios fulfill the climate target. And even if you can see a difference here, and seeing that local self-sufficiency was the scenario that emits the least greenhouse gases, they are all a huge reduction from what we see today. And here are so many assumptions made by us, so you shouldn't put too much attention to the differences between the scenarios. But rather seeing that our findings suggests that that we could fulfill the climate target, but then we assume different technological advances and changed production practices, and all the scenarios demand radical changes when it comes to, for example, car ownerships and how much services and goods that we consume. The diet, for example, in all those scenarios are mostly vegan. There is no strict vegan diet in either of them, but it's mostly vegan. And that is just an example of saying what huge changes that these scenarios imply. Local self-sufficiency is the scenario where you have a bit higher meat consumption. If we take that as an example, since you there have very much local production, we could see a space for that. Okay, but in order to have some room for questions, I will end there by this image. We were very happy to have Sara Granér as she's a Swedish comics writer, and she made the nice images that I used some of them in my presentation here. But I will I will end with that so that we have some 10 minutes for questions or comments.
Okay, so time for questions, and you have to use the microphone since we are recording and streaming. If there is anyone who is not confident in speaking English, you can ask your question in Swedish and I will translate it to English. And then hopefully you will be able to understand Ulrike's answer in English. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very nice. I don't know if the microphone is working. Yeah, I don't know if you hear me well, but okay. Yeah, I was wondering about the calculation that you made in the last slide. What did you use basically? Was it models? Did you have references? Can you potentially sort of have an idea about the uncertainty behind the numbers? I was wondering, for instance, if it could double actually if you had used some other references. Mm. That's my first question. The second one actually, it's about the trend in sustainable development. So you showed some kind of curve to reach your target values. And I was actually wondering if these curves, they actually need to be all positive, or if they could drop for a certain period and then increase again. Because in your automation scenario, I guess it requires a lot of machinery. So we could eventually think that we need major investment in terms of machinery, metal extraction, and so on. And that would require a lot of resources at the beginning. But then at the end, we would not need so much energy in order to run the system, sort of. So just wanted you to provide some details about that.
Okay, thank you. So I start with the second question. So yeah, you're right. So automation demands a lot of energy use on the way to that future. So yeah, you're right. So it's not curves that are all sinking immediately, so they look a bit different. And then regarding the calculations, yes, we did a lot of different assumptions. So if we made them differently, the results would look differently. We looked into, or we had a huge database with very detailed about the emissions caused by different kinds of consumption. And then we had to make assumptions about how the consumption would look like in this future. And for example, then when it comes to diets, we had to make different assumptions, and then for all assumptions we made them based on other research. And there is a paper published where we present all the details. So if you're interested in like all the details, I would recommend you to look into that paper. But the short answer is yes, the results could have been different, but we used the most like proper data that we could find.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yes.
Very interesting presentation, and I really enjoyed it. Two questions. The first is, since the limits of growth, we've been questioning, is GDP growth the right way to go? There is an enormous amount of opposition to the idea of giving up GDP growth. We have belief systems in growthism and neoliberalism that are really keeping us locked into the business as usual kind of approach to development. So first question is, what kinds of responses are you getting from economists to these scenarios? And then the second one is a bit more technical, related to participation. You said it didn't work out quite as well as you had hoped. I was just wondering why. What were the problems?
Okay, regarding economists, we had 2 economists working in the project, and they also like published papers on where they kind of described the growth paradigm that you talk about. But other economists have been reacting to the project and questioned it. But we often come back to saying that no matter what you or how you see economic growth, it might happen that we don't have it in the future. So even if you think it's not good to discuss having like a degrowth, it can be seen as a way of preparing for a future where we do not have economic growth. So that is how we have been reasoning when trying to like put forward why we still think it's good to explore those different kinds of futures where that do not build on economic growth. And then the other question, why we did not succeed in actually kind of co-creating the scenarios. I'm not sure that we were like not successful, but I think if we were to do it again, we would design the process differently. So now we basically had workshops with different actors, and we tried to collect what they saw as main challenges. But then we did most of the interpretation and most of the work ourselves, and we didn't find a good way of having a continuous work together with the actors. And sometimes people didn't follow all the process. So maybe an actor, if an actor, for example, was a municipality, change who the person representing the municipality was, and that made it more difficult for that individual to see what was actually happening throughout the process. I think that was one thing. And then regarding the input from the case study municipalities, I was part of actually doing the work with the scenarios. I was not doing it myself. We were a research group, but that was what I mainly worked with. And then we thought that the other work packages, as we call them, would also work quite a lot with the municipalities and have a lot of contact. But it didn't really turn out to be that. So it was mainly us working with developing the scenarios that had that contact. So we had too little contact, I would say, with the case study municipalities. So that was another reason why they were not involved to that extent that I would have liked them to be. That was just some reasons I come up with now. It would be actually interesting to ponder more about that.
Okay. The time is out, unfortunately. But there are more questions out there and interest in details. I know that there is a website for the project where you can find reports and papers and other materials.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say the website address or what people should research in their search engine.
It seems, I think it only works in Swedish. Is there a pen? Yes. It's www. Oh, it didn't work. And it's bortom bnp-tillväxt.se. Oh, thank you.
Bortom.
Yeah. bnp-tillväxt.se. Yeah.
I actually tried to access that website before coming here and had some problems. So I don't know if it's down.
Oh, really?
Momentarily or
Up and running, but I haven't tried it.
Please check.
Okay, I will.
It worked a week ago.
Okay, good.
So thank you very much, Ulrika, for coming here today.
Thanks.
And thank you for all of you who attended here in Altona and in other campuses, and Berlin, I can see, are with us as well. We have an upcoming open lecture, our next lunch lecture in Framtidslabbet, about a month from now. We will have Tobias Walla, who works at the Swedish Energy Agency, Energimyndigheten, that is in Swedish, who will come here and talk about a future studies project they did called 4 Futures for the Swedish Energy System. And while the future study Ulrika presented to you today was about normative future studies, looking at how a specific target can be met, Tobias will tell us about how to work with explorative future studies, so looking into multiple futures and uncertainties and how to handle them.